Hello, students. Here we are again, A pushers. This is becoming a Wednesday ritual that we have a snow day. But this is A push and we can't stop. We only have about 41 days, 40 days until the big exam. So I'll make this really quick. This will not be a long lecture. There's going to be something that I need you to do after the lecture. It's really just watching a video and taking a few notes. But other than that, you don't have a whole lot to do today. But I wanted to get through this slide and maybe I can figure this out how to, there we go. We started talking about this slide when we left each other, and especially about like Rosie the Riveter. What I want you to keep in mind is that, I'll move this up just a little bit. What I want you to keep in mind is that now during World War II, everything had really changed on the home front, different than it had in World War I. Women entered the workforce in World War I to help with war production and things like that, but not a steady. Like after the war, women went back into the home. But it didn't really happen that way in World War II. After World War II, we see much more of a permanent change in society, especially with women working in industry and outside of the home. So it was different than World War II. And Rosie the Riveter, this kind of propaganda idea that everybody had to do their part, including women, and women can do it. They could help with the big industrial wartime effort. Was a big part of that effort. The other thing I was going to talk about, we did talk about really how it did bring an end to the Great Depression. We talked about that war production board that the United States produced twice the amount of war goods and war material than all of the Axis countries combined. That was a lot. We really supplied all of the Allies with the needed war material. Well, let's talk about the GI Bill of Rights very briefly. This doesn't come around until 1944, but it's a big one, and it's still really in effect today. If you have loved ones or family members in the military, they get some really great benefits, and those are coming from the GI Bill of Rights way back from 1944. Some of the best Bill of Rights were education assistance. The GI Bill will send people in certain jobs in the military to college for free, but you can have a big significant help with college expenses, with tuition expenses. They provided home loans. They guaranteed VA home loans, and in the next chapter we'll look at this. We see all of these suburbs just exploding after World War II. We'll talk about how the GI Bill of Rights really helped that. They provided job training, VA hospitals. My husband works at the VA hospital today. This is an offshoot really of the GI Bill of Rights. We needed to take care of those soldiers who returned from war. You see a picture of Victory Gardens here. There was a time of rationing. You had to ration flour and sugar, and it was really up to the American public, which I will say the Office of War Information was the one directing that. They were the one pushing out all this propaganda, all this information to the public of like what your duty is. And maybe you're not a Rosie the Riveter, but you can still take part in the war effort. And part of that were like Victory Gardens, where you took a small plot of land and you grew food for your own family, for maybe your community, because a lot of the food had to be used and sourced out for the war effort. Or maybe they couldn't have as much food production because a lot of the production was going toward the wartime production. Therefore, you had to grow your own food. And this became a very patriotic thing. In fact, you can see Uncle Sam there. We have the Navajo Code Talkers. I'm going to talk about them more later. Fantastic story if you have ever seen any movies or any documentaries about the Navajo Code Talkers. They, especially the Navajo, but many other Native American tribes as well, they made code that especially the Japanese could not break. Like the Japanese were really, really good at breaking code. They could not break the Navajo code. But we'll get into that again as we go on to the next slide. Okay. Oh, it says 9906. It should be 9066. So, mobilization and military service provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic positions for the war's duration, while also leading to debates over racial segregation. Wartime experiences also generated challenges to civil liberties. So I asked you to listen to WWII Royale, that podcast, and you heard about it, how, these internment camps had started. And this is what Executive Order 9066 is about. Maybe how do I go back? Oh, shucks. I have to stop and go end show. Okay, bear with me. I have it here. There it is. Okay, so this is Executive Order 9066. You can see it came in 1942. In fact, it was pretty shortly, I want to say like May of 1942. So we know yesterday, a date which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. So by early 1942, the war effort is on, and this had come, executive order had come by, I think, the late spring of 1942. So by the virtue and authority vested in me as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders whom he may from time to time designate, whenever he or any designated commander deems such action necessary or desirable, to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from any or which all persons may be excluded. So it goes on, and then you can see at the end, the Attorney General under the proclamations of December 7th and 8th, 1941, and shall supersede the responsibility and the authority of the Attorney General under the said proclamations in respect to such prohibited and restricted areas. What the heck does this mean? What, if we have to summarize what Executive Order 9066 means, it basically set up internment camps in the United States. So we know what's now in history, we know what's going on in Europe with concentration camps, right? Well, the United States set up its own internment camps. We didn't call them work camps. We didn't call them concentration camps. We didn't kill people in there. People did die in internment camps. They were not as bad. You heard in WWII Royale, like, life is not good, but they're not as bad. Basically, they're internment camps for Japanese Americans who were looked at as a threat during this time. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and anybody who was deemed a threat to national security could be removed and put into a concentration camp, an internment camp. I refrain from calling them concentration camps, but I will say that most of them were on the West Coast, especially where Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, would have settled. Now, what's interesting, there's an old broadcaster, his name was Tom Brokaw. He wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. It's about World War II. And he mentions how he grew up near, he was a military child. He grew up near Rapid City, South Dakota. And there was an internment camp actually in Rapid City. And he remembers kind of like walking by the fence and seeing young Japanese children. And he couldn't really figure out, like, why are these boys behind this fence and why can't I play with them? And he'd ask his dad, he was just a little boy at the time. He'd ask maybe his mother, and she would just say, well, she'd kind of give a childlike answer. And he thinks back and he remembers that of, like, he knew something was not right. He couldn't figure out, like, they didn't look like they were impoverished or starved, but he does remember it like, this is odd. So even as far as the western part of South Dakota, we see internment camps. But, like, if the prompt was, to what extent was Executive Order 9066 justified, that's a question you have to ask. This is very much of a racial segregation. This is taking away the liberties. People who could have been born as American citizens, if they had Japanese heritage, were put in these internment camps. So, the idea of why is it written? Well, this is at a time of war when there's a great heightened sense of security, and the threat that anybody who looks Japanese or looks Asian can be put into an internment camp. So this is a really important document to know. So let's go back to the slideshow here. So we see the internment of Japanese Americans in relocation camps. In the instruction to all persons of Japanese ancestry, you have to move to the following areas. If you owned a business, if you had household goods, you just were expected to leave. I have a picture I'll tell you about my friend here in a second, up there in the corner. Let's talk about the Zoot Suit riots a little bit. Now, do you remember when we talked about the Braceros program, how during the Great Depression, a lot of especially Mexicans or Mexican Americans were deported back to Mexico. And then during the Braceros program during World War II, many were brought back to the United States to help in agricultural fields. Well, this produced a lot of racial debates that were going on, and the Zoot Suit riots, especially again on the West Coast, were a big problem. So here in the bottom picture are some Zoot Suiters. Zoot Suits were like kind of these seersucker suits right there. You see how the guy, he's wearing the hat, he's got the long kind of blazer and the kind of baggy trousers on. Those are called Zoot Suits, and they were very much a clothing style of Mexican Americans. Well, the problem became that these guys who were in these flashy Zoot Suits would basically be in the West Coast. Now remember, these are Mexican Americans who cannot join in the war effort. Like, they're not allowed to be, in the military. Although ironically, we're bringing them back to the United States to help with the war effort on the home front. Well, these guys were, like the flashy young men, and when they were kind of getting the girls, if you will. So when soldiers would come back, especially from the Pacific, and they would land in San Diego and San Francisco and near LA and things on the West Coast, the soldiers would expected to find their sweethearts back home, but the Zoot Suiters were the ones kind of having all the fun, dancing away and taking girls out on dates, and it was really a point of contention for a lot of soldiers and sailors who were coming back from the war, and it caused a lot of racial tension, which is quite interesting, that it's basically about how you look and getting a girl. The WWII campaigns, this is a big one. Make sure you write this down. The WWII campaigns was about double victory. It was victory on the war front, right? But it was also about Black Americans. It was about Black Americans wanting to push for a WWII campaign of victory, not only on the war front, but to end segregation, to end this racial strife between people. Jim Crow is still firmly entrenched. We're going to be close to getting a desegregated military, but not yet. We have segregated militaries. There are, for sure, the home front is completely segregated. And so there was this WWII campaign that we don't just push for victory. Black Americans are not just pushing for victory on the home front, but they're really pushing for this to be a change. Like, let's think about those 4 freedoms, right? If we want more freedom and democracy, we have to have it at home. And that's what the WWII campaign was about. We can't fight for somebody else's freedom and democracy if me as a Black American doesn't have it on the home front. And so it was kind of a 2-front campaign. Victory against racial segregation at home, and victory on the war front. We'll talk about that. Segregated armed forces. Eventually we're going to end it, but it's going to take some time. I have to say it's a lot because of the valiant efforts of these really, really impressive squadrons and groups of Native African American men, or even women for that matter, who showed their heroic, their valor, really what they were willing to do for their country. Okay, so I want to talk about code talkers a little bit more, mostly because you know how close to my heart it is. So code talkers were not just Navajo code talkers, right? I've got quite a few lists here of different code talkers. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Choctaw, Cherokee, Comanche, Sioux were also code talkers. So these code talkers were those who could speak their native language, their Native American language, but they also knew English as well, right? There were a lot of Native Americans, not a lot, but a good amount, a minority, but a good amount of Native Americans in World War II. Well, they were almost exclusively used as code talkers, but that's really, really ironic, right? It's ironic because think about what happened during that whole assimilation process. Think about what happened in boarding schools. They were forced to speak English. They were forced to forget their language as a means of assimilation to make, kill the Indian, save the man, right? Well, now we realize, man, these code talkers can use a language that nobody can break. And we can speak in code and use that code to find out about the enemy, to get messages that the enemy can't break to other areas. And so now all of a sudden it becomes a real sad irony that I'm not sure if the American public knew about or if the government even really realized it. We forced them to speak English, and now we're expecting them to speak their own native language to help the American war front. Okay, Asia Philip Randolph and the March on Washington. This has to do with a lot of 8, 9, and 10 are very much connected, and it has to do with Executive Order 8802 because of Asia Philip Randolph. He marched on Washington to basically, he was an African-American man, a Black American, and a big group got together, marched on Washington and said, you cannot have racial segregation or discrimination in the workplace, especially for wartime industry. That's what Executive Order 8802 did. It prohibited racial discrimination in defense jobs, and it pushed FDR to sign this executive order because the March on Washington was a highly publicized. It was a news and noteworthy campaign, a protest, really. And that then brought out the Fair Employment Practices Commission had already been happening, and it bolsters that, and that's why Asia Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement happened. Eventually, the Executive Order 8802 came out in 1944. No, it came out in 1941. It would have happened because of the executive order came out, and then the Fair Employment Practices Commission happened because of that. Okay, so finally, the last thing. Hopefully have the gold sheets available. If not, you can maybe grab it and put this on there. Komatsu versus United States is one of the big landmark cases that you need to know. Now, the reason I have a picture of my friend there, that is my friend, his name is Carl Hamna. He was born and raised in Hawaii, and that's a picture there with his friend. They're both teachers. That's a picture of his friend. Her name is Karen Komatsu. Well, Karen Komatsu's father was Fred Komatsu. Now, Fred Komatsu, this is in 1944, was a young man. He was like 23 years old, and he was arrested and sent to an internment camp. He was arrested because he refused to leave his house and his job to report to an internment camp. Because of that refusal and rejection to report to the internment camp, he was arrested, and his trial went all the way to the Supreme Court. Komatsu versus the United States is that very famous one, that a case, and Komatsu ends up losing, and they said that it was okay to the Komatsu lost. The United States The Supreme Court deemed it was okay for the United States to do that to Fred Korematsu because it was a military necessity. Think back in like Schneck versus the United States in 1917, when they imprisoned people or held people because of the military necessity. You couldn't be spreading those negative brochures and things, words about the United States during World War I and dodging the draft and things. This again was looked at as a military necessity at that time. So my friend Carl Hamna is a classmate with Karen Korematsu. Well, Karen Korematsu's father was, maybe his grandpa, I think it was her father, was Fred Korematsu. Carl didn't even know that because I guess Korematsu is a very common name in Hawaii. He didn't know, like Karen never talked about it. In fact, I don't even know if Karen really knew about it. Carl's never told me that, but it was always like kind of a quiet thing, which tells me that if your case is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, but your daughter doesn't even really know about it, doesn't talk about it, her friends at school aren't aware of it, it tells me a lot about like still the racial divide and separation that's happening in America, even into the probably 60s, 70s, and 80s. Carl is, I think Carl's maybe about 60 now, perhaps, and I would assume Karen is the same age because they were elementary classmates. So it does give a lot of indication of like Fred Korematsu lost the case against the United States government, that this was a racially charged executive order that put him in an internment camp. And, you know, well, we're not going to do anything about it, which was a really sad realization about the state of the separation of races in the United States. Okay, there's a lot on that. I thought I was going to be fast. It's not that fast. Here's what I want you to do. There's a video called The Fallen of World War II. I'd like you to watch that. It's a fairly long video, but it's kind of interesting. There's a part where you can pause it in this narrative. That part, or really any part, an easy way to get some points before the end of the quarter, I want you to write down 5 facts that really stuck out to you. Maybe it's when you pause it. There's a point where it'll say, you know, you can interactively pause it and look at some of these countries and the details. Or maybe there's some other facts that really stood out to you. You're gonna be blown away with a lot of facts there. Write down 5. That's all you got. You don't even really have to reflect on it. I just want 5 facts that came from that video that surprised you or you weren't aware of, and email those to me. All right. Till we meet again. Goodbye.